So today I wanted to explore and explain about the process of the understanding going deeper and deeper and deeper, such that it uproots the old misunderstanding and becomes total understanding. Now, once again, these phrases that we use to communicate can often be interpreted in ways that are not necessarily how they're intended. So when I talk about total understanding, it can seem like that understanding is something, like it is a replacement of the old misunderstanding with new understanding. And it's not quite like that. It's not entirely not that, because clearly when I'm speaking, I speak about information that is understood by my intellect. But essentially, that information is looking, or rather the information is coming from an observation of the system and trying to describe the system as best as possible using terminology. Now, the terminology is only going to be as good as the terminology can be. It's going to be limited by language, limited by definitions, but hopefully with repetition and approaching it from slightly different angles, understanding can start to get a better impression of what is really being pointed at. By hearing things from different angles, we can narrow down, using the intellect, the real point. Now, the intellect is just the beginning point of what we can call the total understanding. And total understanding doesn't end up being a set of knowledge. It doesn't end up being a set of concepts that replace the old beliefs, which were, in a way you can say, knowledge, false knowledge, incorrect understanding. So the total understanding is more accurately, I guess you could say, just the absence of misunderstanding. And in the absence of misunderstanding, the suffering doesn't arise, because the suffering had its roots, or the roots of the suffering was the misunderstanding. So if the misunderstanding is gone, the suffering doesn't arise. And if the suffering doesn't arise, there really isn't need for information. There really isn't need for information about suffering. There isn't need for information about the end of suffering, because there isn't a job to be done. There isn't a problem needing a solution. So we don't need positive understanding to deal with anything. We don't need positive understanding to justify things and make it such that we don't get attached, for example, because the attachment simply doesn't happen. Now, the attachment doesn't happen because the misunderstanding has been uprooted. And it was the misunderstanding that used to essentially create the involvement, the attachment to various things, primarily outcomes. So the understanding is not about being able to talk about life in a lot of detail and understand the workings of the universe and understand all of the different laws, like the laws of karma, if they're there, and all the various cosmic laws, which really just means the way that the universe operates. Our intellect is never going to be able to understand that vastness. It's never going to be able to see the mechanics of the universe in totality. So hopefully we can stop trying to think that we will know, that we will have an understanding as a positive understanding that then replaces the negative thinking, if we look at it like that. the real understanding is a transcending of both positive or negative thinking. That's the silence. The dualistic thinking always creates thoughts relative to something else. And if we are lost in thinking, which means unaware of a place of being outside of thought, we will always look at thinking as binary, this and not that, or want to take a position on a spectrum and say, this is where I am defined or where I exist. And so with that thinking, we often believe that misunderstanding will be fixed by understanding, fixed by new information. Because we've come to sort of know ourselves as a result of success, as a result of outcomes. And so information will be believed to be the cause of getting something. So let's talk about this deepening intellectual understanding and how that happens and what it does in practice. How it ends up becoming what we can call total understanding, which really is just the absence, the uprooting, the dissolving of misunderstanding. So I was having a one-on-one session today, and I get a lot of value out of having these sessions because we get an opportunity to go into a bit more detail in terms of where the person's coming from. And in the questions, certain structures are revealed. The question actually and the interactions reveal a structure that's in place, reveal an interpretation, an understanding of life. And this particular conversation revealed it reminded me of how easily it is, because of the way that we have developed, to see life a certain way and to have no capacity to see it differently until that changes, until something comes in and disrupts the way that our system interprets and actually feels about life. Essentially how our system renders the experience of life. Now, I found that the person I was talking to had a very sharp intellect, and so when it was described, it seemed to sink in. It seemed to make sense. And also the questions that were asked seemed quite considered in themselves. I thought they were good questions. Now, these were the topics that we explored. One is the idea of peace of mind being what it is that we're really looking for. Because it can be murky to have an idea of what it is we're really looking for, because it can easily turn into an expectation. And in order for that not to happen, some nuances and subtleties about what it is we're looking for need to be really understood. So if we didn't have the answer, an answer that says, so what is it in practical terms that we're really looking for? we would probably be less likely to get a chance to really understand the nature of that. So the answer to the question in this teaching framework is what we're really looking for, whether we realize it or not. And what this question means, what is it that we're really looking for, is essentially another way of saying what is available to the human being in this seeking process. So what is it that we end up getting that we didn't have before? Or another way of saying it, what is it that will really satisfy the human being in a meaningful way? So, or what is the highest purpose? Could be another way of phrasing it. If we don't want to say, what am I really looking for? Because if we misinterpret what that really means, we might say, well, you see, that's the problem, is there is a me looking for something because they think they need that. That's what it can easily sound like. The language can sound, what is it that you're really looking for? And we say, okay, I need to know this answer because then it will tell me what I, the me seeker, doesn't have now, that I should be looking for, and that theoretically I need. Now, that type of thinking, it can actually be what spiritual teachings are telling us is the problem: a craving for outcomes, a belief that what you are is not complete and needs something in order to become complete, and will get that in the future because you don't have it now. So why it is valid in a teaching, a spiritual teaching, to actually objectify, describe the objective of spiritual seeking, is because what is being described is something really quite unique. And so when it is understood in its nuances, if it's really understood in its nuances, it will undermine the understanding, the working mind understanding, the functional thinking understanding, will undermine those very issues that I was talking about as the spiritual problem, the spiritual misunderstanding, seeking an outcome, for example. Now, how this is often addressed in spiritual teachings is to give no answer to that question. In fact, to invalidate the question. And often, invalidating that question is very worthwhile because it's a question being asked by the seeking entity, by the entity that is the misunderstanding of what we are. And in fact, it is the dissolving of that entity that creates liberation. It is liberation from the seeker, liberation from the craver, liberation from the thing attached to outcomes. And so in a lot of spiritual teaching approaches, the teaching undermines that question as being part of the problem. And there's a version of that in this teaching, and that is when someone says, okay, peace of mind. So how do I get peace of mind? And in answering that, asking that question, it can demonstrate that there is a doer, which is essentially a belief system that's saying, the one asking the question wants to know how it can navigate life, control life, what it can do of its own free will and volition in order to get the outcome. And so the teaching says, that actually is the dynamic that is the problem, this belief in personal doership. So when there are half an hour, 45 minutes of explaining that the error is the belief in personal doership, and in fact, all human beings are biological instruments, part of life as a whole, and each of us is functioning automatically like a biological machine, meaning there is no doer other than the mechanical movement. So the words are a mechanical movement as a result of my makeup and the circumstance I find myself in. Just like the fan spinning and producing movement of air, this biological machine is producing in this moment words exactly according to its mechanical makeup and design. And so the teaching is saying there is no one here. There is no doer. Who is speaking? We have this idea that there is a who doer is the imagination, a who doer or who controller or who speaker doing the speaking. And in fact, more accurately, there is a machine functioning. A machine speaking, no who, no me doer. Just an instrument functioning. So that's the version in this teaching that says, you see, that's maybe a problem, is the doer asking, how do I do enlightenment? How do I do peace of mind? And so the instruction is, you don't. You, the doer that wants to know, has to realize that you can't do it. You're not equipped. You don't exist. The body-mind organism, the person as a body-mind organism through which consciousness is functioning exists, but that doesn't automatically bring in the doer, because what is being described as the body-mind organism, the person, the body-mind organism through which consciousness is functioning, is being described as a biological machine. And it is the machine, because it is a machine through which consciousness is functioning, that is aware of itself, aware of its experience, aware of life from its perspective. So the awareness of the experience doesn't by default imply that there is a doer. And so this is one of the subtleties that we have to recognize. So when speaking is happening, the speaking is not happening to a doer. I'm not speaking to a doer. What is happening is a body-mind organism is delivering information, new conditioning, to another body-mind organism. And the new information in life is what we can call new conditioning. And the new conditioning changes our up-to-date conditioning depending on how it is received in a very impersonal way. It's not up to the person to decide how they receive the information. The information will land and it will be received automatically by the body-mind organism according to its, let's say, acceptance, not really acceptance but like a sponge receives water. It either is very porous and absorbing, or let's say it's not. And the water is received not because the sponge chooses of its own volition to receive the water or not. The water is received because of the very structure of the sponge. So you could compare a sponge to a piece of stone or a piece of wood. Clearly, the nature of the sponge is to absorb. The piece of wood absorbs less readily. And human beings are very, very complex learning machines, and we all have our unique design, and so some information is going to be received by a particular body-mind organism, and some information is going to be repelled. And the receiving or the repelling is an impersonal action, not something we do consciously. So essentially, one body-mind organism is speaking to another body-mind organism. This body-mind organism is equipped with up-to-date conditioning that understands that these words, any new conditioning from life, has the potential to change the up-to-date conditioning. And so there is no prescription for another doer to do anything. There is just the understanding that the new information may change the genes or the up-to-date conditioning of the person, and if that changes, then the instrument is going to function differently. So now, going back to this notion of peace of mind, and why in this teaching, the teaching has chosen to describe peace of mind, whereas other teachings will say, no, if I describe something that we get, the doership and attachment to outcome is going to grab onto that description and turn it into something that it needs. It is going to hear a description, and as soon as you create a description of something, you turn it into something. The irony is that peace of mind is not a thing. It's not even a feeling or a positive feeling. So a feeling, we might say, oh, well, it's not a thing because it's a feeling. Like I feel excited, or I feel pleasure of the taste of something I like in my mouth, but it's not a thing because it's intangible. No, peace of mind is not, I don't say peace of mind is not a thing because it's intangible, but it's not even a positive, it doesn't have a positive sensation, like taste has a positive sensation. The feeling of hunger, for example, is something that you can be aware of. Now, peace of mind isn't actually something you can be aware of as a thing, not even as a sensation, because it is the absence of suffering. It is the non-existence of the uncomfortable feeling of suffering. So suffering, we can say, is a thing. Suffering is a thing because it feels uncomfortable. It is a sensation. It is part of the experience. An uncomfortableness with oneself. Awareness can be aware of the suffering. Awareness can only know peace of mind as what isn't there, after having experienced suffering and knowing the uncomfortableness of it. And peace of mind is, this is the there is no suffering. And so that absence of suffering is peace of mind. And it is the suffering that creates the sense of boredom, for example, the sense of resentment, the sense of shame, the sense of despair, the sense of hopelessness, the sense of restlessness, which is sort of a form of boredom, a sense that I'm not complete, that I need something, I'm not good enough, expectations, striving for something where within the striving there is a belief that when that happens, then everything will be okay. The idea that that is what I'm looking for. That is something. The suffering is something, and once we become familiar with it, we realize that something creates a very special effect on our life experience. That's something which is essentially either a feeling, or a thought, and even when it's a feeling, it's essentially a thought, a belief, including in it a me idea and what I need and what I did or what the other did to me. And even when it's a feeling, it's this me idea in a very concentrated form. So, important to describe suffering as something, and something which is a thought form, something which is always attitudinal to the circumstance, meaning it is a thought form which is looking at circumstance, looking at outcomes, because essentially circumstance is outcomes, looking at the pleasure or pain of circumstance and outcomes, and having a narrative that says that outcome means this about me. And that narrative, that attitude to circumstance, is always based on the attitude of personal doership and attachment to outcomes. So it's very important. Suffering is something, it's a thought form, it's always an attitude thought form to something that has happened in the past, something that's happening in the present, or something that may happen in the future. So it's an attitude to circumstance, and it's based on the belief in personal doership, which is an interpretation of myself and the other as a separate independent entity that is the controller of life and how and why things have happened. Sort of the buck stops with me. So the imagination is that the person is an individual autonomous entity, separate, essentially, not connected to life. Because if we see ourselves as connected to life, we see we're an instrument or an expression, and not the orchestrator of what happens through us. But if a psychological impression of ourself exists that sees ourself as separate, then we see ourself as the orchestrator, the doer, the one that decided of its own free will and volition how to act. And then we see everyone else like that. So psychologically, we see 7 billion me's, all operating independently, controlled by this imagined me controller, of which every individual human has their own me controller. And it's because of that me controller that things happen the way they do. That's the psychological impression of doership. And the attitude, part of this psychological identity, the attitude of attachment to outcome, is saying, I need things in order to be complete because I don't feel comfortable, which is actually because of the psychological identity. But the psychological identity or the experience is one of uncomfortableness, and the assumption is it's because of circumstance. Whereas it's actually our interpretation of ourself, this idea of ourself, relative to circumstance. So it has nothing to do with the circumstance. It has everything to do with the attitude about the circumstance. So going back to why suffering is described. Suffering is put into the teaching as a description when understanding knows that a description is probably going to be taken by the mind and assumed to be a thing, because it's described. So you can only describe a thing. As soon as you put words onto something, you're essentially implying it's something. That's why the concept is there that keeps saying peace of mind is the absence of. The absence of is something that was there, which is not peace of mind, because peace of mind is not something, and then dissolve that something. That is peace of mind, the dissolution of something. And our brain has trouble when it's very obsessed with form, of imagining the absence of something. Peace of mind is the absence of suffering. That's why in some of the Buddha's teachings, he uses negation as the way of answering the question. So he will answer the question like, what is peace of mind? And he won't say peace of mind is something, but he will describe it exactly as I'm doing now, as the absence of suffering. So the fifth form of suffering is expectation. Expectation is heavily resting on the idea that my happiness is to be found in outcomes, that my happiness is to be found in something. And that attitude grabs hold of something, even if it's an idea of something, and that in itself is the uncomfortableness. So, how is it that describing suffering or describing peace of mind and saying what we're really looking for is peace of mind, how is that helpful? It's helpful because it gives us a basis on which to really look at the different forms of suffering. Guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation. If that objective, if you like, which is not meant as a personal objective that you will achieve, but rather as a description of something that's available. If that description of what is available isn't put forward and the intellect isn't able to think about it, go to its own experience, realize that the descriptions are accurate, and realize that what causes all of its uncomfortableness in life is not so much circumstance, but the attitude to circumstance. And the attitude is described as these different forms: guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation. And so the intellect can see, yes, this has some merit to it. And that's when it'll have a motivation to study, essentially, to listen to descriptions of the different forms of suffering. Until then, it's not interested in a sustained way, in a repetitive way of thinking about suffering, because it will be convinced that it's either looking for something like pleasure, or the teaching has said, you're not looking for anything. You're not going to get anything. Stop thinking that you're going to get anything. It is the dissolution of the one that has the idea it's going to get anything that is liberation. So until an approach comes along that resonates with some people, that describes what we will have, and remember, when I say have, it makes it sound like, oh, we're going to get something. But then the descriptions go on to make it clear it's not quite as the wording sounds. So until a teaching comes along that says, what will I have after liberation that I didn't have before? Our thinking just won't look at suffering in a way that is meaningful and necessary. Now, that's not to say that the other teachings don't have their merit. They have chosen a different methodology. So they're just as valid as far as I'm concerned, because they are also a teaching that has decided on a methodology, and there are many ways to skin a cat. Don't imagine that. So let's look at the form of suffering that is expectation. And remember, peace of mind is the end of suffering. When does it kick in, and what does the intellect need to understand in order for the description of peace of mind to be there, and for our thinking mind not to turn it into an expectation? So firstly, on this topic, I would say the descriptions, the concepts, are concepts of dynamics. So they are describing impersonal dynamics. So impersonal dynamics is very important. It means they are things that happen, but no one making them happen. So if I describe water flows downhill, we know that the flowing of water downhill is impersonal. It's an action because of the physics, the laws of physics. Water flows downhill. Now that's a concept that is a description of a dynamic, and all of the descriptions in the teaching are that. They're descriptions of dynamics that the working mind can look at. The thinking mind will look at it and grab hold of those things that are described as optimal. That's what the thinking mind does. The thinking mind thinks that its completeness is going to be found in pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. So if something is described as optimal, it's going to say, I want it, I need to have it. They're just descriptions. They don't say that you can have them. It may not be your destiny to have it. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't describe it as a dynamic. So, if we also need to see that there are 5 different forms of suffering. Let's work with shame, which is part of guilt. If our system is designed to inject shame into the mix, there is going to be an uncomfortableness because of that shame thought object. It inherently has an uncomfortableness in it. Our expectation component is an expectation for life to be a particular way. And because the shame is uncomfortable, our expectation component of the doer and attachment to outcome, will automatically resist the suffering. It will try to control life, try to make changes happen. The attitude of expectation will try to make changes happen in ways that it has no control over. And so the very act of resisting is in itself the suffering. So we need to really understand that the expectation is essentially uncomfortable with life being any way other than it imagines it needs life to be. And that imagination is as perfect as possible. So there is a resistance to anything, to life, when it isn't like that. So automatically, if there is the uncomfortableness of shame in the mix, especially if life has been described as potentially being free of suffering, the thinking mind says, I've heard about life free of suffering, peace of mind, and therefore I want that. So when another form of suffering kicks in, shame, the expectation part of our psychological identity resists the shame and now has introduced expectation into the mix of suffering. So there is shame plus expectation. And if we come to understand that resisting the suffering is another layer of suffering, and that peace of mind comes by those different layers of suffering dissolving, we might for a moment find that the expectation falls away. the resisting of the suffering, or resisting of the guilt or shame, which really means the insisting that life be different, that my experience of life not be uncomfortable in this moment, that resistance might fall away. That expectation of things being different might fall away. And yet the experience doesn't become one of peace of mind, because the guilt or the shame is still there. And we might then conclude, oh, this doesn't work. This notion of peace of mind being the end of suffering is not accurate, because the expectation for suffering to not be there has fallen away, which means the expectation suffering has fallen away. But the shame is still there, which means the experience is still going to be uncomfortable. So we need to understand that there are different components of suffering. And expectation is one of the components of suffering. Expectation is the attitude of wanting life to be different. And if what gets set in place in the psychological identity's expectation is the expectation, so no longer the expectation for a soulmate, no longer the expectation for finances, and the expectation gets replaced with the expectation for peace of mind, because the doership belief and the attachment to outcome belief has heard of this optimization of life, this highest of goals. And it says, that's what my mission is. That's what I want. So if it has turned its expectation from material into the expectation of peace of mind, there is going to be a resistance to any of the other forms of suffering when they arise. And expectation is not only going to resist suffering, but it's going to resist pain in the moment, the pain of circumstance. But where it's most relevant to what we're talking about here is when the expectation resists different forms of suffering because it has heard about the end of suffering. And it has then turned the end of suffering into an expectation, which automatically has to resist suffering when it arises, because it says, that's not my expectation. That is the presence of suffering, and my expectation is the end of suffering. So someone might say, well, if I have the idea that what I'm looking for is the end of suffering, I've got problems. Because if I have the idea that what I'm looking for is the end of suffering, then that's an expectation. I say, no, not. This is where the subtlety comes in. It's not necessarily an expectation. If you have the idea that liberation is the end of suffering, and it's held correctly or in a healthy way by the working mind, it can be known as a description and not turned into an expectation. Simply put, it can be this way. If someone said to a seeker who has been exposed to, let's say, this teaching, and the understanding has gone deep, and someone said, well, what is it that you're looking for in seeking? While you're seeking, what are you looking for? What are you going to get? And so the seeker could say, okay, I'll answer the question, but I need to include quite a few disclaimers in my answer for you to understand what my internal understanding is. So I have an answer to the question, the seeker could say. What I'm looking for is peace of mind, and peace of mind is the end of suffering. But let me make it clear that that answer is not what the me doer that is attached to an outcome is looking for. because the understanding has gone deep enough for me to understand that the me doer looking for that outcome as an expectation is only going to create resistance to life when life is not in line with the expectation. So let me assure you that what I'm looking for is peace of mind, because I know what peace of mind is. It's the end of guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation. But I may never get it. And we're not saying that the seeker with the deep understanding is not saying they may never get it because the one seeking is the one that gets annihilated, or the one seeking is the problem. No, what their answer is an answer coming from the working mind. It isn't the thinking mind answering the question. And we know that if it's genuine when they say, what I'm looking for is the end of suffering, peace of mind. And let me also clarify that when I say what I'm looking for or what I want is a substitute for what it is that will truly satisfy the human being, what it is that enlightenment is. So it's not what do I want as a craving, but it's the answer to the question, what is it that really in the end is available to the human being and can satisfy the human being. So the seeker says once again, I have an answer for that. The answer is what will truly satisfy us is the end of suffering, what we can call peace of mind. But I know I may never get that. The I may never get that means that the thinking mind, the one attached, is not there. The one attached will never say, I may never get that. The one attached is convinced that it needs to know how to get that. That's all. Once it knows how to get it, it will get it. The one that is seeking peace of mind as a something simply hasn't seen that life is unfolding according to a design or a movement that is way bigger than it. That in fact it is part of the unfolding. So the seeker that says, and I may never get it, is a seeker that has deeply, deeply understood that life is a happening. That life is not its doing. The doer, the one attached to outcomes, which is the suffering, is what blocks the connection to oneself where there is peace of mind, simply doesn't acknowledge that it may not get what it wants. The acknowledging, the deep acknowledging, I may never get it, is surrender. It's the deep understanding, I can't do it. I can't make it happen. And so when we have that understanding in us, the description that says happiness is the end of suffering, the end of guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation. That understanding understands expectation and the dynamic of expectation very well, such that it's almost dissolved, if not completely dissolved. It would understand that the same applies to the expectation of working hard in a job to get a certain outcome. It will understand I'm working as hard as I can with the hope of getting the outcome, but I understand the outcome is not in my control. I may work really hard, set everything up so that it seems perfect, and then an international pandemic may come into the picture a day before the launch, and all of the investment, all of the hard work collapses in a heap, never to be recovered again. Sounds far-fetched, but not really. So, repeating the deep understanding of non-doership and non-attachment as it relates to expectation essentially says, this is what I would like, or what I know is available relative to certain benchmarks. So it's relative to having an easier life, for example. I would like some more finances. So the person might say, I would like finances, but I understand that the finances are not going to deliver my happiness, not going to deliver what will really satisfy. Finances will make life easier on a circumstantial level. Finances will be financial pain. And so why not? If I can get that, if I can have change happen in life, why not? But I won't confuse that with peace of mind, with happiness, which is the absence of suffering. I won't confuse that. And so I will do my best to achieve financial improvement. However, the attitude, I know that the outcome is not in my control. I know that my best in each moment is a happening according to God's will, a happening to my design, a happening according to my design, my genes and up-to-date conditioning, a happening according to my design, my genes and up-to-date conditioning, and how that automatically interacts with the circumstance I find myself in each moment. That's the attitude of non-attachment. I'm not in control of the outcome, and the outcome is not what will deliver my peace of mind. My peace of mind, my happiness, is the dissolution of the psychological identity that is convinced that it needs outcomes and it will somehow be able to get them of its own volition. So I hope that that description demonstrates why it's so important in my mind, in the teaching, to ask this question: what is it as a seeker, as someone that finds themselves applying themselves to a topic of what we can call, let's say, spirituality, knowing oneself, the end of suffering? Why is it important to ask this question? What is it that I'm really looking for? Meaning, what is it that really gets delivered? What is it that will truly satisfy the human being? Now, some people will say, well, you can't tell what will satisfy everyone. You don't know what will satisfy me. How can you tell me what I'm really looking for? Now, I can understand someone saying that. And because everyone's life is completely unique, so even the person that is satisfied because of peace of mind will inevitably have a certain flow of life. So they might do a lot of gardening, for example, because they enjoy it. And so the peace of mind and the gardening coexist. But we have to realize that the peace of mind is not because of the gardening. So I won't be able to say, what is going to satisfy you, or what satisfies all humans, and give a complete answer, because the complete answer will, in the end, be that person's life, which includes also the circumstantial level. However, the peace is not dependent on circumstance. So from another perspective, we can say what everyone is looking for, whether we realize it or not, is peace of mind. And so when someone else would say, well, you don't know what I'm looking for, they're missing the point, or rather still convinced that what they are looking for is a particular circumstance. They're convinced that Well, you don't know what I like. My preferences are my own preferences. And so you can't tell me what I should be looking for or what will satisfy me. And as we start to appreciate the nature of suffering and understand that that is what covers up our innate contentness, our innate peace, then we can put forward a description that at least gives someone something to think about. I would say it's a very accurate description to say what we're really looking for, what will really satisfy humanity in the end, or humans in the end, is the absence of suffering. And that's a generic thing, because suffering for every human is generic. It's always attitudinal to circumstance. And when we don't realize it's about the attitude to circumstance, one person says, I will be happy when my circumstance changes. And the circumstance that they want is something very specific. So they're convinced that their happiness is something very, very specific to them. Because they're not realizing that the uncomfortableness is not the circumstance, not the pain that they don't like, but rather the attitude to the pain that says, it should be different. Life can be different. And if it's different, I will feel good. The change is on this internal attitudinal level. Now, all of these descriptions that I've put forward, they're very wordy. I understand, I apologize for those that don't like the words. However, I think that the words tend to give the working mind information to process. And it's the processing of that information by the working mind, hopefully hearing the words as pointers, as descriptions of dynamics for the working mind and awareness to recognize in one's own experience. This is why sitting and feeling is so important. We're often moving outward or thinking about something. Even in our spiritual seeking, we're thinking and imagining, and what it wants of us is to feel our present moment dynamics, because what is being described are the present moment dynamics. So even suffering is a present moment dynamic. Suffering that is resisting a pain of circumstance or resisting another form of suffering is a present moment dynamic. The resistance is a present moment dynamic to the psychological suffering that's arising or to the pain of the circumstance that is arising. And dropping in to your body and feeling is a way of coming to connect with the dynamics that the concepts are pointing at. So when we connect to the dynamics, the concepts will start to explode in terms of their dimension. They will start to shift from being sort of two-dimensional concepts to really being pointers to a three-dimensional experience. In a way, hopefully, a pointer to the experience allows attention to land on something that previously was unseen or not thought to be important, or land on something that was so bundled up with a whole lot of other sensations and feelings that there was no clarity. And the concept may just create a teasing apart of various components that, when merged together, create create such a mess of feelings that there's no ability to understand them clearly. And so as they're teased apart, as the feelings are teased apart, with the aid of the pointer that has sort of described and say, hey, those two things look like they're one, but see that there might be two See that they might be two, not one, even though they look like one. And as attention is brought to it, then more detail tends to reveal itself. So that's how the understanding can go deeper and deeper and deeper, starting off with an intellectual understanding. And then as the intellectual understanding is seen, or the intellectual understanding is used as a pointer to see what it's really pointing at, by default, the understanding is then going deeper and deeper and deeper. And that deepening understanding, so really that means seeing the dynamics of life as they really are, by default starts to uproot any deeply ingrained beliefs that include in them an opposing idea of how life is. So the other question that was asked is very much along this lines. It was, you say life is a happening. Life is a happening. And to me, that is just a concept. It's just intellectual. Life is a happening. Will that concept, that life is a happening, go deeper until such time as I experience life as a happening? That was the question. And I said, well, the understanding going deeper does start off as an intellectual understanding. But when we take a concept like that, life is a happening, is there enough detail there for the working mind to really get a grasp of what it's pointing at? What does it mean? What does life as a happening mean? So I'd like to just describe, because it really is this deepening of the understanding that changes the way that life is rendered. It changes the whole experience such that it is rendered, means created, finished off. I don't know, some people might not understand the word render, filled in a radically different way. Just because the misunderstanding has been extracted, seeing life as duality or seeing life as only duality, let's say, means, which is supported by a whole lot of concepts about life that have been put in place just from our experience of growing up in life. Those concepts create a certain interpretation of objects and the other, and therefore life is rendered like that. And so when we hear something else, like life is a happening, it's like we go to our experience, and our experience is how our system is rendering the life experience. And so we hear this, life is a happening, we go to our experience, and often we say, well, there's nothing in my experience that confirms that statement. Makes sense to me. The understanding going deeper is not, it really isn't about us intellectually overlaying a story about what's happening that is a different story to what we had before. The understanding going deeper is such that the structure, the human being changes radically in how it knows itself and how it knows life. And the whole thing then is created differently. And then the concept, life is a happening, is, of course, it's like, that's perfect. That's exactly what my life experience confirms moment after moment. Life is a happening. And we might remember back to the time when that was just a statement we heard, and it sounded interesting, and it sounded like something I wanted to understand, but if I was honest, it was just an intellectual understanding. And so that's why I found this discussion today very very powerful, because the person asking was asking with integrity, like saying, look, I want to understand deeper. So is this concept that I have, that I've picked up, life is a happening, is that eventually going to go deep so that I can know life like that? And so my answer was, well, not really, because that particular concept on its own, life is a happening, what does it really mean? So we need to flesh it out a little bit. We need to explain what it means. And as it's explained, the working mind will receive the sub-concepts, the supporting concepts that support why it's said that life is a happening. And with the supporting concepts, the working mind now has enough enough to get its teeth into. And that means enough to contemplate. And as it is contemplating this, it can then hopefully start to see certain dynamics that it didn't see before. And so that really is how the understanding goes deeper and deeper and deeper. And I know people feel this change happening. I get the feedback. It's like life is so different. On a practical level, the suffering is no longer arising. And when it arises, it gets cut off quicker and quicker and quicker. And that's not an intellectual interpretation. It's not positive thinking. It's about a structural change. It's energetic, you could say, because the structure is a structure of energetics. And so many of the beliefs that we have, so many of the interpretations we have about life being separate and the human being separate are blocks or energetic structures within the overall energetic structure. And so as they change, the whole energetics in the structure rebalance. And so the movement starts to be a movement that is not just the movement of the intellect. It's the intellect that shifts first, and then the deeply ingrained beliefs shifts. And as those start to shift, even if a small percentage of them shift, then the whole energetics in the body are shifting. And that's when we start to feel life feels differently. Life is seen differently, palpably, qualitatively differently. And essentially life is a happening is in brief, just to give some supporting concepts for that the working mind to think about. It's pointing out how life in totality is an impersonal movement. So we go back to the description of water flowing downhill. That's a description of a dynamic. Water flowing downhill, it's an accurate description, but there is no one doing it. The water isn't choosing to flow downhill. It can't choose to stop at a particular point in time and then choose to start again. And the wind is not choosing to blow or to move. And the trees don't choose to get swayed. It's all a happening that is impersonal. Now, the human being is part and parcel of life, and every human being is being moved, being lived in principle in exactly the same way as the water and the wind and the trees. It's just that the structure of the human being is more complex, and so there are more moving parts, there are more cosmic dynamics at play in a human being than there are in water. Primarily, it's the thoughts and the emotions and the feelings in the human being that we interpret as being personal. We interpret as being that which I have produced, that which I am in control of. So we have to ask, what is this I that says the thinking is my doing? It is a belief. The belief of doership, of personal doership. And so if we can see that the human being is moving in exactly the same way in principle, which means according to the cosmic laws and the design of the entity, as the trees and the water and the inanimate objects. So thinking is essentially the output of a movement of electromagnetics through the neural network. And the thoughts are an output of physics. The feeling in the body of hunger, for example, is a biological output. Now, not something that we've produced. Where it's hard for us to understand this, if we talk about mechanical movements and mechanical outputs, we tend to not relate to the body as mechanical. We're used to thinking of mechanical as made of metal and plastic. If there was a toy set that you can buy for kids, which was 1,000 little robots that are designed to do something, and you put them on the floor in the middle of the room, and you press a button that activates them all, some electronic radio signal or something, and they all start moving in unison with each other and creating something, building something with themselves, let's say. Now I'll just move away from the robots for a second and look at ants and bees. They're all functioning according to their design. The bees, ants don't go and land on flowers and do stuff with pollen, whereas bees do. That's their design. They're genetically designed to function that way. And it might be easier for us to see insects as mechanical, much more mechanical than human beings. Much easier for us to imagine these little metal robotic things as being mechanical. So we say there's no one there doing it. So when we look at the robots, who is climbing onto the other one, creating a formation? There is no who, there is just mechanics at play. And so when we see ants running along the, their corridor, they're going one way and then they bump into each other and turns around the other way. And I've watched ants going one way, they bump into another one, then they turn around as though they get confused. And sometimes I wonder whether, they just get hit on a sensor and so they turn around. I don't know. But somehow they seem to know, they seem to function. But to me, the functioning is some sort of automatic functioning based on their design. And it's an automatic functioning that is designed to meet and to achieve certain objectives. So it's very easy for us to, when we're looking at the little robots, see there's no one there. As it comes to human beings, we're so used to the experience of not being mechanical because we have an idea of what mechanical is, and because of the consciousness that functions through the human being and the sense of I, our intellect can't reconcile that with being mechanical. Now, I'm not even asking it to call the consciousness mechanical. I'm just looking at the biological and psychological movements. So the consciousness, you could argue, is not biological or psychological, because I'm not describing the consciousness as mechanical. It may be a form of quantum mechanics, and we don't understand quantum mechanics, so that could be an output of quantum mechanics. But leaving that aside, what I'm pointing at is that on a circumstantial level, on a biological level, the biological movement of the human is mechanical. And when we look at it, there's a heart that is pumping. It's a pump. And there's a liver that filters. It's a filter. And there are many other organs that operate in more or less the same way as the mechanical organs that we know in our car. So the veins and the blood vessels are like pipes. There's a temperature control system that keeps everything thermostated and keeps everything in homeostasis. There are eyes which are like cameras. There are ears which are like microphones. There's a mouth which is like speakers. There is a brain which is like a central processing unit in the computer that connects all the different bits of hardware, the hard drive and the speakers and the microphone. And so the more we look at the human being, the more we may come to see that we are extremely mechanical. Biological mechanics. Now, that's not reducing or trying to reduce humans down to something less than they are. What I'm saying is that all of the amazing experiences of love and the various emotions are a result of the complexity of this biological machine. So it doesn't say, oh, we are not amazing instruments. We are amazing instruments. That doesn't mean that we're not instruments. And so life is a happening is really saying life is not my doing. That's what it's trying to get at, is life is a happening. It is all one singular happening of life. You could look at it as many what might seem like individual happenings across the world, but if our vision can sort of pull out a bit like when we're on Earth, we see everything from this perspective, and if we can pull out and we were looking at Earth from a space rocket, we see Earth as a whole. And so from over here, from within the experience, it seems like there's no cohesive whole. And as we pull back out, we start to see everything as a movement of one singular big movement. And the body is part and parcel of that movement. The body is not the one necessarily aware of the rest of life. Because when that happens, if it's the body that says, oh, that's life out there, there's me, and then life out there, the body has psychologically then extracted itself out of life. And so now the oneness of life, the happeningness of life, is the happeningness of life and then me. The separate doer that is not part of the happening of life. So what is crucial in this is to allow the body, which includes the psychological movements and the biological movements, to be part of what is witnessed as the interconnected movement of life. And to see whatever happens through me is a happening and not my doing. Whatever happens through the other is a happening and not their doing. Life is a happening. And we don't start off seeing life like that because in our system there is a whole lot of other concepts that within those other concepts, which we could say are misunderstandings of life, within those other concepts there is the sense that I am separate, I am the doer, so therefore we see everyone else as separate and the doer, insulated from life, which means uninfluenced by life. And therefore, the assumption is that the thoughts, because they happen within this body-mind organism, and the impression is this body-mind organism is uninfluenced by anything else, then the thoughts are believed to be my thoughts. And so the system essentially has this attitude towards whatever happens in the body as my doing, because it's not influenced by anything else according to the way it's been locked away, the understanding, which is really misunderstanding, that's been locked away. And so then that renders an experience of life which we can call separation. I am separate from life. I am independent and insulated, and therefore we see all the others as separate. As that ingrained belief starts to weaken, and it weakens when, let's say, the concept, life is a happening, not my doing. Why is it not my doing? Because I'm a machine designed by life, and the concept is the machine, the biological instrument, is a result of the genes, and then the way that life conditions it moment after moment after moment, which then creates this singular entity which we can call genes and up-to-date conditioning. And neither of those factors were in the individual's control. So as this is contemplated and felt, we come into the body and we feel the beliefs, the reactions of separation, the reactions that say, I am the doer, the other is the doer. We feel that, and then question it, and then maybe get a sense that, of course, this reaction that I'm calling my reaction is a happening according to my history. I'm afraid of dogs, for example, because of a history of being attacked by dogs for some people. And so if a dog barks or comes in the room and they feel the fear come up, they might see, of course, that's not my doing. That's a reaction in this body-mind organism based on its genes and up-to-date conditioning, which included at some point the new conditioning of a dog barking at them, or maybe even biting their leg, or chasing them. And that new conditioning in that moment got locked away. And so from then on, the dog comes into the circumstance and there is a reaction. And that reaction is impersonal. There's no one doing it. Who does it? A body-mind organism designed by life functions. Fear arises. And then we might see the thought arising that says, oh, I shouldn't feel afraid, or blaming the owner of the dog for being blasé when they know that you're very scared of dogs, and letting the dog out. And we might understand, oh, they let the dog out because they can't understand my fear. They're dog owners, they love dogs, they don't fear dogs. So it might become obvious that they can't comprehend how fear feels. They think it's nothing. Whereas if an owner can somehow connect, because maybe they at some point were afraid of dogs, and someone says, I'm petrified by dogs, please don't let your dog into the room when we're talking, keep it outside, can you? And that owner, who might appreciate that, will go to more efforts maybe to keep the dog out. And so then if the dog comes in because the owner's not so concerned, the fear will arise, and then the blame towards the owner might happen. But if we recognize that the fear is a result of my genes and up-to-date conditioning, and the owner being blasé is a result of their genes and up-to-date conditioning, that is the beginning of the understanding going deeper and deeper and deeper. And I noticed in some of these talks over the last couple of days, when I started talking about people's views towards government, that I've been observing over the last few weeks and being amazed at how deeply ingrained people's reaction towards things that have happened in the past, how deeply ingrained they are in a way that says that they shouldn't be like that. Like, even if, for me, even if I acknowledge, I see corruption, let's say, in a particular movement, and it becomes clear that some decision 50 years ago was based on corruption and an abuse of people, whatever, the internal relationship can be an assessment that on one level, the dynamic was of, let's say, corruption or doing something for the good of corporation rather than the good of the people. So there can be an assessment of that. However, there's nothing inside that says it shouldn't be like that. Because I really had to ask the question, why is it, Roger? Why is it? And it occurred to me that on a deep level, I just know that life is one way, the way that it unfolds, and that it's much bigger than any individual action, that the individual action that happened, no matter how good or bad the outcome is, was part of the movement, like a wave that starts off and then continues, and in each moment the wave is the way it is. And so if life isn't seen that way, and life is seen as a whole lot of decisions made by autonomous entities that should have and could have acted differently and shouldn't have certain standards and certain morals or lack of morals, that and so an idea, which is an expectation that people be different from how they are, then of course I would look back on something, especially if it's less than ideal, and I could imagine some alternative, some ideal. And so I was looking at it and I said the change, the deepening of the understanding was so total that when it's looked back, when I look back on the past or something that is described, it's a description of what is. So no question about it being something different. And it's the same with, let's say, if we look into the future and we see this vaccines being mandated, and let's say I don't want to be forced to have a vaccine. That's my preference. The preference exists along with the understanding that says, but I might not get my preference. That's life. Like, my preference is not to be forced to have a vaccine. Although I can understand that some rationale will say it's in the best interest of humanity. I can actually support a rationale that comes to the conclusion. I'm not saying that's the only rationale that makes sense, but I can think about it and say, yeah, someone has come up with a rationale that says we can't give everyone choice or it defeats the purpose, which will endanger humanity. So I go, my preference is not to be forced to take a vaccine. But I'm not in control of that. I might not get what I want. And I can actually see why a policy that is different to my preference might actually be valid. So the same principle applies. It's like the seeing of a dynamic that can, in theory, be different. The assessing of, when something is in place like that, it delivers a consequence, and that consequence is not my preference. That is just an objective assessment of the situation. However, nothing on a deep level says, and it shouldn't be like that. Even if I were to become really physically sick to the point of being incapacitated, right? That is not a positive outcome on a circumstantial level. That is not pleasure in the moment, but it is life unfolding. And the only way that there can be an acceptance of how life unfolds, especially when it isn't your preference, that means that is not going to deliver pleasure when that unfolds. However, the acceptance is not about it being pleasure. The acceptance is being aligned with the unfolding of life as it unfolds. So I say from the outset, I would much, much rather as much pleasure be included in the unfolding of life as possible. But I understand that that is not in my control. The amount of pleasure and pain that will be in our life is predetermined by the very complexity of the unfolding of life. And so when I was thinking about this and talking to people, I see when I say that to people, they say, "Are you serious? You mean you really wouldn't feel resistance to this situation?" I say, "No, it's not just because I think what happens is we listen to the concepts and they sort of sound nice. Sometimes they aren't interpreted as really what can happen, really how life can be experienced. More like as if it's a nice story. Oh yeah, I'll run with that story. I can see how everything is predetermined, for example. But then the reaction in the moment is different. The reaction in the moment is, no, it shouldn't be like this. And not only in the moment, actually, because in the moment the biological reaction can be in resistance to circumstance, because if the circumstance is going to be painful, there can be a biological resistance. But I'm talking about the ongoing attitudinal resistance of someone who says, yes, I completely get that. I completely get it's all predetermined. And then yet in practice, the ongoing attitude is about seeing the other as the enemy, the other as a me doer that should have done it differently. And so that means the understanding hasn't penetrated down to a level of having uprooted the belief in personal doership. And when it does, you will look back on life as a happening, as a singular movement of life. You'll look at the present moment as a singular expression of life, and look at the future as a singular expression of life that will turn out one way, sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain. And the seeing of life that way means the non-arising of the attitudinal suffering, which sees the other as the enemy, the competitor, the rival, right? And feels uncomfortable with oneself for those actions that happen through me that deliver pain to myself or to the other, and feels an uncomfortableness and hatred with the other, which really, when we look at it, is an uncomfortableness with oneself. It's the end of that attitude, and it's replaced by an attitude that says, yes, life happens that way. And remember that doesn't mean that we won't have outbursts of biological reaction. But once those biological reactions subside, then the horizontal ongoing reaction will be a reaction of the absence of guilt and blame and pride and worry and expectation. It just won't be a story that can be conjured up outside of the biological response to a circumstance. And even, mind you, the biological response many of them can be tempered by a lack of importance in those particular outcomes. So as the attachment to outcome falls away, we might find that biologically a lot of circumstances that used to seem significant are now seen as pleasures and pains that without attachment linked to them are really not so significant. So the biological reaction to it raining, for example, when we are all dressed up and it starts raining and we sort of lose our composure in terms of our appearance or whatever, it might not create, it's pain, it's not our preference. But it might be something that we go, oh yeah, that's not so significant. Whereas there are some biological reactions or some circumstances that will create a biological pain that is significant for that particular biological instrument. And so there will be an outburst, and then horizontally in time after the outburst, peace of mind. And in fact, we see that in that outburst, there isn't suffering. The outburst could be interpreted as a blaming someone or an attachment to outcome, but when it's seen as a valid biological response, then it won't be interpreted by someone else, if they have that understanding, as being necessarily suffering. And more importantly, for the person themselves, because really this is not about how the other person sees it, but the person themselves with this understanding will know that in those outbursts, there isn't suffering. If there is suffering, which is a feeling that hopefully we become very familiar with, then it just means that the understanding hasn't penetrated totally, and we need to, wait for life to bring attention onto the seed of that remaining misunderstanding, and in time that too will probably dissolve. And to the extent that it's small suffering that arises, once a month for 2 seconds or 3 seconds, because this idea of peace of mind hasn't been turned into something that the doer is owning, if suffering arose for 2 minutes, like, who cares? But what? That was 10 minutes ago. It arose for 2 seconds, 10 minutes ago. Who cares? Because in practical terms, that hasn't disturbed your ongoing peace of mind. It has for 2 seconds. Who cares? The one who cares is the one that's turned unbroken peace of mind into an objective that it has received or it is worthy of, and then the slightest disturbance of it means, it's not it. In practical terms, it's like, who cares? 2 seconds of suffering. So, my goodness, I can talk, can't I? Let's see what questions we have. Hi, Shaista. Is that how I pronounce your name? Sorry, I didn't have you there for a second.
Hi.
Hello.
Switch off the video. How are you, Roger?
Yes, very good. And you?
Can you see me? I don't know whether I... Yes, very well. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you so much. Honestly, again, your talks are so detailed and comprehensive that I feel that, you cover everything, and we don't have any as such questions left on one hand. And on the other hand, I just want to talk about, again, it's not just one question, about experience. So my experience perhaps now is one of ease, and as I said, it's a good experience, like normal day to day, and there's no suffering. But when I hear you talk about end of suffering, and then I've heard a few perhaps other teachers also talking about end of suffering in a different way, the question arises as if it's, I wouldn't say that it's an event which happens once and for all, but if you listen to many others, it sort of feels like as if it's sort of an event, also, not a big one perhaps, but just something they notice, maybe a very mundane, a day-to-day. Okay, this is it.
Yes, there is such a thing, but it's not what we. There is such a thing as that event, or those events which I would call peak experiences, but they are not events that bring suffering to an end. They are significant peak experiences, realizations, you could say, or insight are often included within those peak experiences, and they are significant as part of the process, but they are not the process, or they are not it per se. So in Zen there is a saying that says awakening is spontaneous and deliverance is gradual. And so it really means that awakening is part of the process, and then there is the deliverance after that. And the awakening can take many different forms, some of which are very subtle. And so when a very subtle awakening happens, a teacher isn't going to refer to it, because for them it was very subtle. And then those teachers that along their path had very pronounced, significant awakening experiences, they'll tend to focus on it and talk about it, because that's their experience, that was their process. So if you like, I can talk a little bit about why some teachings focus on the awakening as opposed to the deliverance, because that can help explain this.
Well, I would again I'll come back to my own experience, and I would say that the experiences I've had, the big ones I will call, as I said, those were, now that you're saying end of suffering, so I know, but those are again words for me, whatever you have said or all the other teachers. Thankfully, I now know that they're all again concepts and words, but because I have lived those, I have had experiences, I would say, maybe that's the word I can use, where there was end of suffering. Mm-hmm. So when there was end of suffering, there was nothing new had happened. Mm-hmm. But what I'm saying is, then who was still enjoying life, who was still there, who was doing all that, nothing had changed. So again question is that, so when that end of suffering happened fully and completely, I didn't know it was end of suffering, or it was just me living life.
Yeah.
So was it just still an experience, and was it a mental experience, A? And B, when it sort of got diluted, where am I now? I mean, I don't know how should I formulate a question. So who was enjoying life then?
Yes.
And who is seeking now? I know and I don't know. I mean, it's my experience, obviously, so I should be knowing it.
Well, I would say that it was. So, how do I pronounce your name? Shaista?
Shaista, yes.
Shaista. So, I would say that in that period where suffering fell away, it was Shaista that was experiencing life. So, in this teaching, we don't say that liberation is the end of the ego. In fact, in this teaching, the ego is...
Thank God you don't say that, because I had an issue with that for a long time. This word ego was like, I used to be scared of this word and all, and the word I also. And thank God when I listened to your teaching, it all sort of made sense. And a lot of my ideas went away. Mm-hmm. And actually so much had gone, so much had shifted ever since I've been listening to you, because the teacher, as you call them, top-down teacher, the Muji and all the Rupert teaching. Mm-hmm. So they are all just one angle teaching, and it was very difficult to integrate and to know where we are. So thank you for that. Yes, sorry, Atu.
No, that's okay. So those teachings are predominantly angling on bringing about an awakening, which, as I've said, is a very important...
Which they did, yes.
Yeah, and that awakening tends to be... now, I believe that this teaching, because if I say that, it makes it seem like, oh, this is only valid after an awakening, for example. But I think that this teaching will bring about the same effect as an awakening, which I'll describe in a second, but in it'll be experienced a bit differently. It will happen a bit differently. So the awakening, when it happens, is a bit of a dislodging, right? A separating out of an entangled, what we can call identification of awareness with form. And awakening in that, in those various experiences that can be very profound, and they don't have to be profound, but if it's a peak experience where the state, the qualitative nature of the experience changes, and primarily the key factor in a peak experience is the sense of identity is different, meaning who we know ourselves as or what we know ourselves as is experientially shifted. That's one of the prime characteristics of what I would call a peak awakening experience. And sometimes, and in that shift, some bonds have been broken. Bonds of identification that kept things lacking a certain perspective. And that's why the awakening is so important, because it reveals an aspect of experience or an aspect of the human being, whichever way you want to look at it, that was previously covered over by the content of the experience. And once that aspect is revealed, this separating happens. And once the separating happens, we're able to, I guess, find a different reaction, attitudinal reaction to what was happening before. Now, when that separating happens, and it coexists with a peak experience where the sense of self is known to be quite different to before, the assumption is that it's the state that is causing the lack of suffering. And I would say it's not really the state that is causing the lack of suffering, it's the separation that is causing the lack of suffering. But if that state changes, if the state sort of returns to one where the sense of self is located in the body again, the merging or the identification doesn't have to go back to the way it was. And that can be very confusing for someone when the separating out, the witnessing, happened simultaneously to...
But in my experience, I never had oneness, I never had separation or unification, or it was just me, normal, ordinary life, my children, cooking food, doing all that, but there was no suffering. And I didn't even know the word suffering. I mean, I knew what it was and how it's different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's why...
But what I'm asking is, was that a state and an experience, obviously, because it has passed and that's it, or was it...
No, so...
What did...
So that's why I was starting with the sort of profound experiences that are often talked about, and saying why they're important is because they create a separating out. But the separating out doesn't have to be accompanied by that particular experience, that particular state. The separating out can happen in a much more subtle way, and yet the separating has happened. The disconnect, the non-identification, let's say, has happened. So when you know yourself, just as Shaista, being a mum, cooking, that actually is, to me, is more integrated. It's a more integrated form of liberation, if the suffering is non-existent in that state, the state of just being an ordinary human being. So what has happened in that state is that the doership and attachment dynamic fell away. And so it was Shyster, what I would still call Shyster, the ego. And Roger is an ego, Shyster is an ego, Ramesh is an ego, Ramana was an ego. Ego means consciousness linked and functioning through a particular body-mind organism. So all human beings, even the most enlightened, are what in this teaching is described as an ego. So liberation doesn't annihilate the ego in this teaching. We are the ego. You know, we can't be annihilated. What we are is the ego. What gets annihilated is the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcome. So
that's in Islam, it's called shirk. And that I understood so fully, completely with your teachings. And so, you know, thank you so much for that, because it sort of somehow it brought me back to this human life you're teaching, and this, the word you use, that, you know, the doership dissolves. It put the whole Quran into the teaching of Quran into this perspective. That the shirk it talks about is that, you know, it's just this doership. And
sorry, it broke up.
It did so much. I said it has done so much. Like I had insights and all. Understanding got so clear and so deeper just with this your teachings, because that's the whole Quran is based on one of these things, which is a doership.
Yeah, and even when you look
I never understood that.
That's why when you look at the other Advaita teachings, when they refer to ego, really they're referring to the doership. But why they will sometimes call it the person or the individual or Roger or whatever is because until the doership is dissolved, the way we know ourselves is as the doer. And so the teaching has to say, okay, you know yourself as the person. The person only knows themselves as the doer. So I might as well tell you that what dissolves is the person. Because as
took
far
fear away from me, yes. A lot of fear went away with that. And thank you so much again. As I said, it's the doer which, and because I've had experiences and still I didn't know. The teachings were so they kept on saying the ego has to go, and the fear was that, you know, everything will go from here.
Yeah. See, so now you've sort of answered your question. Is that so? Who was experiencing? Who was enjoying? Was the word you used? Who was enjoying life when suffering fell away? And I say Shyster was enjoying life because the doership dynamic had dissolved and wasn't causing its havoc. Now, what can tend to happen is that we get these glimpses or periods where the doership gets disabled, let's say, gets put on hold, and it's in a way it's a taste of what liberation for the human, or what is available as human living, human experience without the doership. And seeing that and living that is a consequence of, let's say, your understanding having deepened. Sometimes it can happen for people, out of the blue with seemingly no preparatory work. And either way, it's either a result of your understanding deepening because of the spiritual seeking, and then it's a glimpse, a taste of the complete suspension of the doership. And that gives us more information, essentially. It gives the system more information. It gives it a reference point of knowing beyond just an imagination. You have your own experience of it. And so then the suffering, if there's any left, if there's any of the doership dynamic left, can then re-emerge again. It can come back. And it's about that being worked on a little bit more, being seen, being understood. And hopefully that taster can contribute to the process of the remaining doership being completely dissolved. And so when it gets completely dissolved, then essentially the seeking stops. And why does the seeking stop? The seeking stops because the suffering isn't there. So we find ourselves seeking again when suffering comes in. When the suffering dissolves, there's nothing to seek. It's here. So I would say if the suffering has come back in again, it's simply a consequence, let's say, of some of the doership and attachment to outcomes still having some remnants in the system. And it's just a matter of time, especially if you're, clear on what the point is, what the concepts are pointing at, and you're able to see the suffering when it arises, maybe it gets cut off. It's just a matter of time for it to run out of steam.
No, it has. It has been happening. The process is just happening by itself, but not now. So whenever, obviously, it's a big topic. You have talked about it a lot. The psychological mind and the practical mind. I know you have spoken about it a lot, and I have listened to it a lot. But sometimes we still do get caught up, or we get confused about these two. So if whenever you have time, you can just a bit more just talk about it a bit more in detail, so that we have more clarity perhaps about that. And I don't have as such any more questions. They get answered as you speak, but I just have a lot of gratitude towards your teachings, towards you, Ramesh, and all the other teachers. But you have actually made me, I would say, human again, but I'm going to keep on saying that still. But, and even the Quran I had, as I said, because the conditioning was that. Now I have so much of clarity of that also, and it's just to do with these teachings, and especially your teachings, the Shahada, the doership, everything as if it has just, downloaded within myself.
That's lovely to hear.
That, so
I feel particularly
thank you so much.
I feel particularly touched when that's the feedback, because this really is all inspired. I've sort of accepted now that I have my flavor infused all the way through it, because it's from my own direct personal experience. But it's really Ramesh's teaching that is coming through me, and this is exactly what Ramesh's teaching did. In my process is after a deepening of the awakening experience where I didn't think I was a person. Ramesh said, well, come back down here, because liberation is not out there. Liberation is here for the human being. And so I really value that is such an important part of the process, especially if our path has taken us through the top-down teachings, which in itself is a great blessing. But then I see that there's this vacuum, in a sense, that is being filled to some extent by this teaching that Ramesh put forward, that fills that delivers a very necessary piece of the puzzle. So thank you for the feedback.
Absolutely, no. Thank you so much. Thank you. Bye.
Okay. Goodbye, Shasta. We'll just have one more question, and I'll keep it quick. Hi, Jim. Hello, Jim.
Hey, hi.
Hi there.
So, I had an experience yesterday that I was in a good situation, but my body couldn't feel it. I got a layover. I'm working for my last 2 days of work. I was in Manhattan Beach, California. Beautiful day. Everybody's outside, healthy. And then I get to fly sit first class in a lay-down seat on a 787 back home and get paid for working it. And I couldn't get out of this feeling of despair, and I couldn't get excited about it. The plane was empty. I should have, I couldn't. I think it's I'm fearing the future, regretting that I didn't build a life that I love, but in Virginia. I can't, I don't know why I couldn't enjoy that moment. And I tried meditating. I tried saying, look at this. I'm sitting in first class in a lay-down bed watching Linda Run's that documentary. Why can't I enjoy this?
Yeah, well,
I try to be present, observing of it.
It's a perfect opportunity for you to register actually something that was your very own experience, which proves really that unhappiness is not dependent on circumstance. Because that's one of the deep realizations we have to see, is that, oh, my happiness is about the attitude to the circumstance. And in the case of deep suffering, it isn't necessarily a conscious attitude, but a remnant of an old, locked away attitude of doership and attachment to outcome. So the feeling of despair has in it attachment to outcome and doership, right? In the old locked away feeling of despair, if we went to the root of despair, we will find that it includes the attitude of doership and attachment to outcomes. And so the way I hear what you're describing is that the old energy of doership and attachment to outcome that you weren't in control of got released into your system. The feeling you had was despair, and it will tell you, the feelings of suffering tell you this is absolutely true. There is no hope. Your future is finished because of whatever the circumstance is or whatever you didn't do, and it can be completely convincing. And it just floods the system. And so the fortunate circumstance seems completely irrelevant in the face of this existential feeling of uncomfortableness. And so you have your own experience there, that the suffering, you could be amongst a whole lot of friends, you could be in very fortunate circumstance, and it doesn't come anywhere close to fixing the uncomfortableness. And so this is really, as far as I'm concerned, where it's really useful is for you to register that the suffering is independent of circumstance. It's an internal feeling of uncomfortableness. And that's something we need to register and lock away for ourselves.
So uncontrollable, it seems. It's like, I guess I'm not supposed to control it. I guess I'm supposed to say, I'm trying to figure it out. Like, is this a chemical thing? Did I not sleep enough last night?
Yeah.
I should be able to. I've been, I got to experience that state of oneness. Why can't I get there now? It's like, so I guess the point is we're just accept it.
Yeah. Well, even what you just said is another insight out of it. It's so uncontrollable, and then we want to control it. And so what we need to do, well, what needs to happen in the end is our system to really register, I can't do anything about this. This is destiny. It will come. It'll do its thing. It will create a certain experience, and it will go. And if we can see this as an energy that comes in, influences the system and then goes, essentially it gets turned into an object, into a feeling object that can be witnessed and left to its own devices. And that's really important if that starts to happen.
Yeah, that's it's a practice. It's not. It's a just learning. I don't know what I'm doing, but don't know mine. That's the best place to be. Thank you for having this. This is a great way to wake up in the morning. It's 9 o'clock in Virginia.
Very good. Thanks for
and
joining.
I'm a night owl. I wish I was in Australia. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Jim.
Bye.
See you.